The chair scraped against the hardwood floor, and the sound of it cut through the room like something breaking. Not the chair, not really, but something. Nadia O.C. Crawford had been sitting at the far end of the Kellerman dining table for 11 years, and in that time she had learned to read the room the way a navigator reads weather. Not by what was said, but by what shifted. The way Clifford's mother, Josephine Kellerman, would rearrange the place cards before a formal dinner so that Nadia always ended up beside the children's table or near the kitchen door. The way Clifford's older brother, Prescott, would make his observations about her neighborhood growing up. Scarborough, he would say the word like it was a diagnosis, and then look at his wife and smile, as though geography was a kind of verdict on a person's character. She had learned not to react. She had learned, over 11 years, to fold herself smaller. That night, the night of the Kellerman Foundation Gala, held as it was every October at the family estate in Rosedale. The dining room was full, 47 people. Kellerman relatives from Calgary and Halifax, business associates, a federal cabinet minister, who Clifford's father, Reginald Kellerman Sr., had been photographed with at a conservative fundraiser in 2019. A provincial court judge, 3 CEOs whose company names Nadia, recognized from the financial pages she read every morning at 5 a.m. before the rest of the house was awake. She had been awake at 5 a.m. that morning, too. She had been reviewing the final term sheet for a $340 million acquisition her firm, Ovista Technologies, was completing in 36 hours. No one at the Kellerman table knew that. They knew what Clifford had told them, which was partial and imprecise in the way that a man's description of his wife's work is often partial and imprecise when he has not fully reconciled himself to her surpassing him. She runs a tech company, something in enterprise software. She does well. That last part he said, with a particular tone that made it sound like a concession. The trouble with the chair started when Prescott's wife, Annalise, arrived late and found her seat taken by one of the Calgary cousins. The table reshuffled. Someone moved Nadia's place card without asking her. She found herself seated between Josephine Kellerman and a man named Harold Finch, who was Reginald Sr.'s accountant, and who, within 4 minutes of sitting down, had asked Nadia whether she was with the catering company. She had said no. He had nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not sure they believe you, but have decided it would be rude to say so directly. Josephine had watched the exchange and said nothing. This was the particular shape of the Kellerman family's hostility. It did not announce itself. It arrived in small packages, carefully wrapped, with plausible deniability attached. The caterer assumption, the Scarborough comments, the family photographs where someone always seemed to step in front of Nadia at the last moment, the Christmas where Josephine had given every daughter-in-law a piece of jewelry and had given Nadia a cookbook, not because Josephine knew anything about Nadia's cooking, but because a cookbook felt like an appropriate thing to give to someone you weren't quite sure what else to give. Nadia had thanked her. She had always thanked her. 11 years of thank yous. 11 years of showing up, of dressing carefully, of moderating her voice, of laughing at the right moments and being quiet at the right moments and trying, relentlessly trying, to be the kind of person this family could not find fault with. It had not worked. What she had understood, somewhere around year 4, a realization that arrived not in a single moment but gradually, the way water finds the low point of a floor, was that the problem had never been anything she had done. The problem was what she was, and what she was, to the Kellerman family of Rosedale, Toronto, was wrong. Wrong neighborhood, wrong background, wrong accent. A working-class Scarborough accent she had spent years softening, and then, in her late 30s, had stopped softening because she had decided she was done apologizing for the fact that she had grown up in a house where money was counted carefully. Wrong face, though no one in the Kellerman family would ever say that plainly. They were not that kind of people. They were the kind of people who were very clear, very often, about not being that kind of people. Clifford was not the worst of them. That was perhaps the most complicated part of it. He had loved her, once, in the way that some people love things they cannot quite categorize. He had been attracted to her drive, to the way she entered rooms, to the fact that she had built a company from a basement office in Scarborough with $12,000 in savings and a laptop she'd bought refurbished. He had said in the early years that she was the most capable person he had ever met. He had said it proudly to his friends at parties. Look what she's building. You should see what she's building. But pride is a complicated thing in a marriage, and somewhere in the middle years it had curdled. He began to introduce her differently. Then he stopped introducing her at all. She would arrive at his firm's events and stand beside him, and he would talk to colleagues without gesturing toward her, and she would eventually extend her own hand and introduce herself, and there would be a pause. Just a fraction of a second, but she felt it, where his colleagues would glance at him to calibrate how to respond. By year 8, she had stopped attending his firm's events. By year 9, she had stopped asking to be included. By year 10, she was running a company with 340 employees across 4 cities and a product suite that 3 Fortune 500 companies had integrated into their core operations. And Clifford was still, at dinner parties, describing what she did as something in software. She had said nothing. She had swallowed it. She had kept coming to the Kellerman family events because she had decided that walking away was not something she would let them force her into. They would not get the satisfaction of having driven her out. She would leave when she decided to leave. On her own terms, in her own time. That time, it turned out, was tonight. Though she did not know that yet, when she sat down at the table and unfolded her napkin and smiled at Harold Finch and asked him, pleasantly, how long he had worked with the Kellerman family. The dinner proceeded. 4 courses, a wine pairing that Josephine had clearly spent weeks arranging. Conversation moved around the table in the Kellerman way, a mixture of financial commentary, light gossip about people Nadia barely knew, and the occasional political observation that everyone in the room was expected to nod along with. Nadia nodded. She ate. She contributed the occasional remark that was received politely, and then redirected elsewhere by Josephine with the practiced ease of a woman who had been managing social traffic for 40 years. It was during the dessert course that the first thing happened. Prescott had been talking about a property development his firm was involved with. A project in the distillery district. Significant square footage, significant financing, and he was describing the challenges of the current market with the satisfaction of a man who finds difficulty energizing rather than deflating when his phone buzzed and he looked at it and made a sound. Turn on the TV, he said to no one in particular. We're in the middle of dinner, Josephine said. No, seriously. Turn it on. BNN. They're talking about the Ovista deal. The room shifted. Someone found the remote. The television mounted near the sideboard. Josephine's one concession to modernity in an otherwise traditional dining room came to life. The anchor was mid-sentence. Acquisition, expected to close within 48 hours, would represent one of the largest enterprise software transactions in Canadian history. Ovista Technologies, led by founder and CEO Nadia Crawford, has, the anchor continued. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, Ovista Technologies acquisition, 340 million deal to reshape Canadian tech sector. And then, because the segment was not content with the headline alone, the image cut to a profile photo. Nadia's photo. The one from the Globe and Mail piece 3 months ago. The one her communications director had approved. The one where she was standing in the Ovista office in a gray blazer with her arms crossed and an expression that her assistant had described as very calmly terrifying. 47 people turned to look at the woman at the end of the table. Nadia took a sip of her water. She did not look at anyone in particular, but she had spent 11 years learning to read this room, and she could feel all of it, the recalibration, the silence. Harold Finch's intake of breath beside her, the way Prescott's voice had gone very quiet, the way Josephine had set down her fork with a particular precision, the way the cabinet minister had leaned slightly forward, the way Clifford had gone absolutely still in his chair at the other end of the table. She looked at Clifford. He was not looking at her. This is where she would later tell a friend. Her oldest friend, a woman named Bev, who had grown up 2 streets over in Scarborough, and had been the first person Nadia had called when she closed her Series A funding round. That she understood something she had been deferring for a very long time. Not that the marriage was over. She had known that for a while, in the abstract, the way you know a season is ending. What she understood in that particular moment was that she had been the only person in the room who had not known what she was worth. Not because she lacked information, but because she had been, for 11 years, allowing other people's assessment of her to occupy the same space as her own, as though the two were equivalent. As though Harold Finch's caterer assumption had some claim on the same reality as $340 million. It didn't. It never had. Then Clifford spoke. He said it quietly, intended perhaps for only her to hear, but Josephine Kellerman's dining room had very particular acoustics, and the table had gone very quiet, and what he said traveled the length of it without difficulty. "You could have told me about this," he said. Not proud, not warm, something else, something tight and controlled and aimed at her, the way a man aims something when he has decided that the best defense is to find fault with the other person before they find fault with you. "Could have told you," Nadia repeated. "I'm your husband." "You are," she said. "I find out about my own wife's business from the news." "Clifford," she said, quietly, evenly, "you have never asked." The silence after that was different from the other silences of the evening. It had weight. Clifford's jaw tightened. What happened next? And she would think about it later, trying to reconstruct the sequence of it, trying to identify the exact moment when something that had been bending for 11 years finally broke, happened fast. Clifford pushed back his chair. He stood. He said something that she would later have difficulty fully quoting, because her memory of it was blurred by what followed. Something about respect, about being made to feel like nothing in his own family's home, about her always making him feel small. And then he moved toward her end of the table with a kind of rigidity, a controlled anger that she had seen before in the small private versions of this argument and had been frightened by, and he grabbed her arm at the elbow, hard enough that she felt it, and she stood, instinctively, to get her footing. And he said, loudly now, so there was no question that 47 people could hear it. "You think this changes anything? You think any of this?" He gestured at the television, "makes you something you're not." And then he raised his hand. He did not finish the motion, because the provincial court judge, a woman named Justice Rollins, who had been seated 3 chairs down, and who had been still and watching throughout the entire exchange, stood up. She placed her napkin on the table. She said, in the voice of someone who has been pronouncing consequences in a courtroom for 22 years, "Mr. Kellerman, sit down." It was not a suggestion. And then, because Justice Rollins' standing was apparently sufficient to unlock something in the room that had been very tightly held, other people stood. The cabinet minister, 2 of the cousins from Calgary, Annalise, Prescott's wife, who had never once in 11 years said anything directly to Nadia except to compliment her earrings, stood up and said, "That's enough, Clifford." And Prescott, to his credit, she would acknowledge the credit, because she was not in the business of denying it when people did the right thing, even late. Prescott put his hand on his brother's shoulder and said his name once firmly, and Clifford sat down. The room was very quiet. Josephine Kellerman had not moved, had not spoken. She sat at the head of the table, with her fork still beside her plate, and her face entirely composed, and her eyes on the tablecloth. And she was the clearest thing in the room to Nadia in that moment. Not Clifford, not the television, not the 47 people who were now very fully not looking at anyone directly, Josephine. 11 years of carefully curated hostility. 11 years of place cards rearranged and cookbooks at Christmas and the word Scarborough said like a verdict. 11 years of small, deniable, accumulated disapproval. Nadia picked up her napkin from her lap. She set it on the table, beside her plate, in the spot where it had been folded when she arrived. She took her bag from the back of her chair. She did not say anything to Clifford. She looked at Justice Rollins and said, "Thank you," quietly and directly, the way you thank someone who has intervened in a situation you were handling, but who made the handling easier. Justice Rollins gave a short nod. She looked at Annalise, who had the expression of someone who understood, perhaps for the first time, what they had been watching for several years, and who was not entirely comfortable with what that understanding implied about themselves. "Thank you," Nadia said to her as well. Then she walked toward the door. She did not walk quickly. There was no reason to. She had built a 340 million company in 11 years, starting from a basement in Scarborough with a refurbished laptop and 12,000 in savings. And she had spent the entire time walking at whatever pace she decided. She had never needed to rush to reach the things she was going to reach. She was not going to start now. The dining room was behind her. The front hall, the wide front door of the Kellerman family estate. Outside, Rosedale was cold, the way Toronto is cold in October. That particular cold that arrives without announcement and makes the air smell like something changing for good. She stood on the front step for a moment and took a breath. Her phone buzzed. Her chief financial officer. 3 texts in sequence. The term sheet was finalized. The counterparty had signed. Closing was confirmed for 9 a.m. Thursday. She put the phone in her pocket. Bev called at exactly that moment, the way Bev always seemed to call, at exactly the right moment, as though she had some internal clock calibrated to the moments when Nadia needed to hear a voice from home. "I saw the BNN segment," Bev said, without preamble. "I was at a Kellerman dinner," Nadia said. "Oh no, it's fine. Was it terrible?" Nadia thought about Josephine Kellerman's face. About the tablecloth. About 11 years of place cards. "It was clarifying," she said. There was a pause, and then Bev made a sound that in 22 years of friendship, Nadia had learned to recognize as the sound of someone choosing not to say "I told you so," which was one of Bev's better qualities. "The acquisition closed," Nadia said. "I know," Bev said. "I literally watched it break on the news. I called you immediately. I have to call Darius," she said, meaning her M&A lead, who had been managing the transaction for 14 months. "Call me after. I will." She stood on the step for another moment. Behind her, through the thick front door of the Kellerman estate, she could hear the low murmur of 47 people beginning to reckon with a dinner party that had gone somewhere none of them had anticipated. She thought about that for a moment. Then she called her driver. Then she called Darius. Then, while she was waiting, she sent Bev a voice note that began with the words, "Okay, you were right," and contained approximately 4 minutes of very precise detail, because Nadia OK Crawford had always been very precise about the things that mattered, and some things you need to say out loud to make them real. The car arrived. She got in. She did not look back at the house. She had learned, very early in her life, in a house in Scarborough, where money was counted carefully, and possibility was still treated as something you could reach if you reached far enough, that the direction worth looking was forward, that the things behind you could teach you what you needed to know. And after that, they had no further claim on your attention. She had the deal. She had the company. She had Bev's voice in her ear, and the city moving past the car window, and 47 people sitting in a dining room in Rosedale understanding, possibly for the first time, something important about what they had been looking at for 11 years and not seeing. It was enough. It was, she thought, more than enough. The lights of the city came up around her as the car moved south, and Nadia O.C. Crawford, founder and CEO of Ovista Technologies, looked out the window at the skyline she had built something in and felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely like herself.